For if a distribution is reached that everyone regards with roughly equal overall approval, and the force of individual political convictions, in each person's judgment of how well he regards it, is simply to approve the result because everyone else does regard it equally, then the distribution must be one in which each person regards his own impersonal and personal preferences as equally fulfilled as well. Suppose Arthur is less satisfied with his impersonal and personal situation than Betsy. Arthur can have, by hypothesis, no political theory or attitude that could justify or require a distribution in which he is less satisfied in this way than Betsy is, so Arthur can have no reason to regard the distribution with as much general or overall approval, combining political, impersonal, and personal assessments as Betsy does. But suppose the shared political theory is not the ideal of equality of overall approval, but some other, non-egalitarian theory that could provide such a reason. Suppose everyone accepts a caste theory, so that though Amartya is somewhat poorer than others, the distribution leaves his preferences as a whole equally fulfilled because he believes that he, as a member of a lower caste, should have less, so that his preferences as a whole would be worse fulfilled if he had more. Bimal, from a higher caste, would also be less satisfied overall if Amartya had any more. In this situation, unrestricted equality of success does recommend a distribution that no other conception of equality of welfare would. But it is unacceptable for that very reason. An inegalitarian political system does not become just simply because everyone wrongly believes it to be. Unrestricted equality of success is acceptable only when the political preferences that people happen to have are sound rather than simply popular, which means, of course, that it is in the end an empty ideal, useful only when it rubber stamps a distribution already and independently shown to be just through some more restricted conception of equality of success or through some other political ideal altogether. Suppose someone denies this and argues that it is good in and of itself, when everyone approves of a political system highly and equally no matter what that system is. This seems so arbitrary and so far removed from ordinary political values as to call into question whether he understands what a political theory is or is for. In any case, he does not state an interpretation of equality, let alone an attractive one. In personal preferences, we must surely restrict equality of success still further by eliminating, from the calculation it proposes, at least some of what I called people's impersonal preferences, for it is plainly not required by equality that people should be equal, even in so far as distribution can achieve this, in the degree to which all their non-political hopes are realized. Suppose Charles very much and very deeply hoped that life would be discovered on Mars, or that the great American novel would be written within his lifetime, or that the coast of vineyard would not be eroded by the ocean as it inevitably continues to be. Equality does not require that funds be taken from others who have more easily fulfilled hopes about how the world will go and transferred to Charles so that he can, by satisfying other preferences he has, decrease the overall inequality in the degree to which his and their non-political preferences are fulfilled. Should any impersonal preferences be salvaged from the further restriction this suggests, it might be said that the various impersonal preferences I just took as examples are all impossible dreams or, in any case, all dreams that the government can do nothing to fulfill. But I cannot see why that matters. If it is right to aim to decrease inequality and disappointment in all genuine non-political aims or preferences, then the government should do what it can in that direction, and though it cannot bring it about that there is life on Mars, it can at least partially compensate Charles for his failed hopes by allowing him to be more successful otherwise. In any case, I might have easily taken as examples hopes people have that are not impossible, or even particularly difficult for government to realize. Suppose Charles hopes that no distinctive species will ever become extinct, not because he enjoys looking at a variety of plants and animals, or even because he thinks others do, but just because he believes that the world goes worse when any such species is lost. He would overwhelmingly prefer that a very useful dam not be built at the cost of losing the snail darter. He has not set out deliberately to cultivate his views about the importance of species. If he had, then this might be thought to raise the special issues about deliberate cultivation of expensive tastes that I shall consider later. He just finds he has these views. But after the political process has considered the issue and reached its decision, the dam is built. Charles's disappointment is now so great, and he cares so little about everything else, that only the payment of a vast sum of public money, which he could use to lobby against further crimes against species, could bring his welfare, conceived as the fulfillment of all non-political preferences, back to the general level of the community as a whole. I do not think that equality requires that transfer, nor do I believe that many, even of those who find appeal in the general ideal of equality of welfare, will think so either. Of course, equality does require that Charles have a certain place in the political process I described. He must have an equal vote in selecting the officials who will make the decision, and an equal opportunity to express his opinions about the decision these officials should take. It is at least arguable, moreover, that the officials should take his disappointment into account, perhaps even weighted for its intensity, in the general cost-benefit balancing they undertake in deciding whether the dam should be built, all things considered, that his dissatisfaction should count in a Bethamite calculation and be weighted against the gains to others that the dam would bring. We might wish to go beyond this, perhaps, and say that if the community faces a continuing series of decisions that pit economic efficiency against species preservation, it should not take these decisions discretely through separate cost-benefit calculations, each of which Charles would lose, but as a series in which the community should defer to his opinion at least once. But none of this comes neat arguing that the community treats Charles as an equal only if it recognizes his eccentric position in a different way by undertaking to ensure, so far as it can, that his success in finding all his non-political preferences fulfilled remains as high as everyone else's when the series of decisions is completed, no matter how singular his impersonal preferences are. Indeed, this proposition contradicts rather than enforces what conventional ideals of political equality recommend, because if the community acknowledged that responsibility, Charles' opinions would very probably play a role far beyond what these traditional ideas provide for them. But someone might still protest that my arguments depend on assigning to people impersonal preferences that are in the circumstances unreasonable, or rather unreasonable to expect the community to honor by compensating for their failure. My arguments do not, it might be said, suggest that reasonable impersonal preferences should not be honored in that way, but this introduces a very different idea into the discussion. For we now need an independent theory about when an impersonal preference is reasonable or when it is reasonable to compensate for one. It seems likely that such a theory will assume that a certain fair share of social resources should be devoted to the concerns of each individual, so that a claim for compensation might be appropriate when this fair share is not in fact put at his disposal, but not if deciding as he wishes or compensating him for his disappointment would invade the fair share of others. We shall consider, later in this section, the consequences of using the idea of fair shares in this way within the theory of equality of success. It is enough to notice now that some such major refinement would be necessary before any impersonal preferences would qualify for the calculation of equality of success. Nor does it seem implausible to restrict a conception of equality of welfare to success in achieving personal, as distinct from both all political and all impersonal ambitions. For that distinction is appealing in other ways. Of course, people do care, and often care very deeply, about their political and impersonal preferences, but it does not seem callous to say that in so far as government has either the right or the duty to make people equal, it has the right or the duty to make them equal in their personal situation or circumstances, including their political power, rather than in the degree to which their differing political convictions are accepted by the community, or in the degree to which their differing visions of an ideal world are realized. On the contrary, that more limited aim of equality seems the proper aim for a liberal state, though it remains to see what making people equal in their personal circumstances could mean. Equality of personal success. Relative success. We should therefore consider the most restricted form of equality of success that I shall discuss, which requires that distribution be arranged so that people are as nearly equal as distribution can make them in the degree to which each person's preferences about his own life and circumstances are fulfilled. This conception of equality of welfare presupposes a particular but plausible theory of philosophical psychology. It supposes that people are active agents who distinguish between success or failure in making the choices and decisions open to them personally, on the one hand, and their overall approval or disapproval of the world in general, on the other, and seek to make their own lives as valuable as possible according to their own conception of what makes a life better or worse, while recognizing, perhaps, moral constraints on the pursuit of that goal and competing goals taken from their impersonal preferences. There is no doubt a measure of idealization in this picture. It may never be a fully accurate description of any person's behavior, and it may require significant qualification in many cases. But it seems a better model against which to describe and interpret what people are than the leading and perhaps more familiar alternatives. So I shall not quarrel with this psychological theory, but we must notice at once a difficulty in the suggestion that the resources of a community should be distributed, so far as possible, to make people equal in the success they have in making their lives valuable in their own eyes. People make their choices about what sort of a life to lead, against a background of assumptions about the rough type and quantity of resources they will have available with which to lead different sorts of lives. They take that background into account in deciding how much of what kind of experience or personal relationship or achievement of one sort must be sacrificed for experiences or relationships or achievements of another. They therefore need some sense of what resources will be at their disposal under various alternatives before they can fashion anything like the plan for their lives of the sort that this restricted conception of equality of success assumes that they have, at least roughly, already created. Some of these resources are natural. People need to make assumptions about their expected lifespan, health, talents, and capacities, and how these compare with those of others. But they also need to make assumptions about the resources they will have of just the sort society would allocate under any scheme of equality of welfare, wealth, opportunities, and so on. But if someone needs a sense of what wealth and opportunities will be available to him under a certain life before he chooses it, then a scheme for distribution of wealth cannot simply measure what a person should receive by figuring the expense of the life he has chosen. There is therefore again danger of a fatal circle here. But I propose to set that problem aside as another instance of the kind of technical problem that I promised not to labor. So I shall suppose, once again, that the problem can be solved in a trial and error way. Suppose a society in which people in fact have equal resources. It is discovered that some are much more satisfied than others with the way their lives are going. So resources are taken from some and given to others on a trial and error basis until it is true that if people were successful he believed himself to be at fulfilling the plans he had formed given the level of resources he now has, each person would indicate roughly the same level or degree of success. But this solution of the practical difficulty I described brings to the surface a theoretical problem to which the practical difficulty points. People put different values in personal success and failure, not only as contrasted with their political and moral convictions and their impersonal goals, but just as part of their personal circumstances or situation. At least they do in one sense of success and failure. But we must now notice an important distinction I have so far neglected. People, at least as conceived in the way just described, choose plans or schemes for their lives against a background of natural and physical resources they have available, in virtue of which they have discrete goals and make discrete choices. They choose one occupation or job over another, live in one community rather than another, seek out one sort of lover or friend, identify with one group or set of groups, develop one set of skills, take up one set of hobbies or interests, and so forth. Of course, even those people who come closest to the ideal of that model do not make all these choices deliberately in the light of some overall scheme, and perhaps make none of them entirely deliberately. Luck and occasion and habit will play important roles. But once the choices they do make have been made, these choices define a set of preferences, and we can ask how far someone has succeeded or failed at fulfilling whatever preferences he has fixed in that way. That, I shall say, is the question of his relative success, his success at meeting the discrete goals he has set for himself. But people make these choices, form these preferences, in the light of a different and more comprehensive ambition, the ambition to make something valuable of the only life they have to lead. It is, I think, misleading to describe this comprehensive ambition as itself only another preference people have. It is too fundamental to fit comfortably under that name, and it is also too lacking in content. Preferences represent the result of a decision, of a process of making what one wants more concrete. But the ambition to find value in life is not chosen as against alternatives, for there is no alternative in the ordinary sense. Ambition does not make plans more concrete, it is simply the condition of having any plans at all. Once someone has settled on even a tentative or partial scheme for his own life, once his discrete preferences have been fixed in that way, then he can measure his own relative success in a fairly mechanical way by matching his situation to that scheme. But he cannot tell whether his life has succeeded or failed in finding value simply by matching his achievements to any set target in that way. He must evaluate his life as a whole to discover the value that he has, and this is a judgment that must bring to bear convictions that, however inarticulate these are, and however reluctant he might be to call them this, are best described as philosophical convictions about what can give meaning or value to any particular human life. I shall call the value that someone in this way attributes to his life his judgment of that life's overall success. People disagree about how important relative success is in achieving overall success. One person might think that the fact that he is likely to be very successful at a particular career or love affair or sport or other activity counts strongly in favor of his choosing or pursuing it. If he is uncertain whether to be an artist or lawyer, but believes he would be a brilliant lawyer and only a good artist, he might regard that consideration as decisive for the law. Decisive. Someone else might weight relative success much less. He might, in the same circumstances, prefer to be a good artist to being a brilliant lawyer because he thinks art so much more important than anything lawyers do. This fact that people value relative success differently in this way is relevant here for the following reason. The basic, immediate appeal of equality of welfare, in the abstract form in which I first set it out, lies in the idea that welfare is what really matters to people, as distinct from money and goods, which matter to them only instrumentally, so far as these are useful in producing welfare. Equality of welfare proposes, that is, to make people equal in what is really and fundamentally important to them all. Our earlier conclusion, that in any event the fulfillment of political and impersonal preferences should not figure in any calculation aimed at making people equal in welfare through distribution, might well be thought to damage that appeal, for it restricts the preferences that people are meant to fulfill in equal degree to what I have called personal preferences, and people do not care equally about the fulfillment of their personal preferences as opposed to their political convictions and impersonal goals. Some care more about their personal preferences as opposed to their other preferences than others do. But a substantial part of the immediate appeal I described remains, though the point would now be put slightly differently. Equality of welfare, it might now be said, makes people equal in what they all value equally and fundamentally so far as their own personal situations or circumstances are concerned. But even that remaining claim is forfeit if equality of welfare is construed as making people equal, so far as distribution can achieve this, in their relative success, that is, in the degree to which they achieve the goals they fix for themselves. On this conception, money is given to one rather than another, or taken from one for another, in order to achieve equality in respect some value more than others and some value very little indeed, at the cost of inequality in what some value more. A person of very limited talents might choose a very limited life in which his prospects of success are high because it is so important to be successful at something. Another person will choose almost impossible goals because for him the meaning is the challenge. Equality of relative success proposes to distribute resources, presumably much fewer to the first of these two and much more to the second, so that each has an equal chance of success in meeting these very different kinds of goals. Suppose someone now replies that the appeal of equality of welfare does not lie where I located it. Its purpose is not to make people equal in what they do value fundamentally, even for their own lives, but rather in what they should value fundamentally. But this change in the claims for equality of welfare achieves nothing, for it is absurd to suppose that people should find value only in relative success without regard to the intrinsic value of importance of the life at which they are relatively successful. Perhaps some people, those with grave handicaps, are so restricted in what they can do that they must choose just so as to be able to be minimally successful at something. But most people should aim to do more than what they would be, relatively, most successful in doing. Overall success. This discussion might be thought to suggest a better interpretation of equality of welfare, namely equality of overall rather than relative success. But if we are to explore equality of welfare in that conception, we must make a distinction not necessary, or in any case not so plainly necessary, in comparing relative success. We must distinguish a person's own judgment of his overall success, or, if we prefer, the judgment he would make if fully informed of the pertinent ordinary sorts of facts, from the objective judgment of how much overall success in fact he has. A person's own judgment, even if fully informed of the facts, will reflect his own philosophical convictions about what gives value to life, and these might be, from the standpoint of the objective judgment, confused or inaccurate or just wrong. I shall suppose here that equality of overall success means equality in people's overall success as judged by themselves, from the standpoint of their own perhaps differing philosophical beliefs. I shall later consider, under the title of objective theories of welfare, the different conception that requires equality in the success of their lives judged in some more objective way. So let us now alter the exercise we have imagined. Now we rearrange resources as far as we are able, so that when we have finished, each person would, at least if fully informed, offer the same assessment, not of his relative success in achieving the goals he selected for himself, but of his overall success in leading a valuable life. But we must take care in describing just what we take that latter opinion to be, for there are many different beliefs, each of which might possibly be thought to count as an assessment of one's own overall success, and it is of crucial importance to decide which of these, if any, should play a role in rearranging resources in the name of equality. Nor can we find much guidance in the literature either of welfare economics, or of utilitarianism, which are the natural places to look. For most of those writers who argue or assume that welfare consists in the fulfillment of preferences seem to have had relative rather than overall success in mind, and in any case have not discussed the problems raised by the latter idea when the two ideas are separated. The language they use, the language of preferences, or wants or desires, seems too crude to express the special, comprehensive judgment of the value of a life as a whole. We might begin by distinguishing the question of how valuable someone believes his life has been, taken as a whole, from the question of how much he wants his life to continue. These are certainly different matters. Some people, to be sure, wish their life to end, or are in any case almost indifferent whether it continues, because they regard it as a failure. But others wish to die just because they think their life has been too brilliant to tarnish with a slow decline. And others think that a successful life can be made more successful by the timely use of suicide as a creative act. People can want to end, that is, a life they are proud to have led. Can we say at least that if someone wishes to die, he must regard the future life he would otherwise lead as having no or little value? This will certainly be so in most cases, but the connection is nevertheless, I think, contingent. He may only think that though his future life would be quite successful, his life as a whole would be more successful if it ended now. Nor does it follow from the fact that someone very much wishes to continue living for as long as he can imagine, that he thinks that his life is a successful life, or even that his future life will be especially successful. He may, on the contrary, want to live longer because he thinks his life has been unsuccessful, because he needs more time to do anything worth doing, though it is more likely that he simply fears death. The distinction I want to make can be summarized, perhaps, this way. Someone's preferences about the length of his life are just that, preferences that are like his choices of jobs and lovers, fixed as part of the nominating exercise of deciding what life, given background assumptions about resources, would be the most valuable life all things considered. They are not in themselves judgments of overall success or failure. Can we make a further distinction between the values someone finds in his own life and the value he believes it has for him? I am not sure what that latter phrase would mean as part of this contrast. We sometimes say that a person puts a low value on his own life when we mean not that he is not proud of the life he has or will lead, but rather that he counts the value of that life low compared with the value he puts on his duty or the lives of others. But we are now considering something different, not the value someone puts on his own life as compared with his moral or impersonal values, but the value he puts on that life as part of the assessment of his own situation. Perhaps the value of someone's life for him means only the intensity of his preference that his life continue. If so, the distinction between the value someone finds in his life and its value for him is the distinction we have already discussed. But someone who uses that phrase may have in mind something more complex and more elusive than that. He may mean to distinguish someone's judgment about the value of any single human life, or indeed human life in general, to the universe as a whole from that person's judgment from the inside, from the standpoint of someone charged with making something valuable of his own life. If so, then it is the latter judgment with which we are now concerned. Or he may mean to distinguish someone's judgment of his own success in that assignment, given his talents and opportunities, from his judgment of whether it was good for him to have had the talents and opportunities and convictions that made him the person whose life would have most valued lived that way. It is not hard to imagine lives that illustrate the distinction so understood. It is in fact a cliché that great artists often work not out of enjoyment, even in the widest sense of enjoyment, but rather in constant misery simply because it is not possible for them not to write poetry or music or paint. A poet who says this may well think that a life he spent in any other way would be, in the most fundamental sense, a failure. But he might well think that the conspiracy of talents and beliefs that made this true was bad for him, meaning only that his life would be more enjoyable if he lacked these talents or did not have the belief, which he could not however shake, that a life of creating poetry in misery and despair was, all things considered, the most valuable life for him to lead. Suppose we then ask him the dark question only philosophers and sentimental novelists ask: would it have been better for you if you had never been born? If he says yes, as he might in some moods, we would know what he meant, and it would not be that he has done nothing valuable with his life. If the distinction between someone's judgment of the value of his life and his judgment of the value it has for him is taken in this way, then it is the former judgment I mean by his judgment of his overall success. But if the distinction cannot be taken in this way, or in any of the other ways I have considered, then I do not understand it, and suspect that it is no distinction at all. These scrappy remarks are intended to clarify the comparison we must intend when we propose that people should be equal in their overall success. We cannot carry out this comparison simply by discovering two people's own fixed preferences and then matching their situations to these preferences. That is only a comparison of their relative success. We must invite them to make, or ourselves make from their point of view, an overall rather than a relative judgment that takes fixed preferences as part of what is judged rather than the standard of assessment. If we ask them to make that assessment themselves, however, and then try to compare the assessments each makes, we may discover the following difficulty. Suppose we ask Jack and Jill each to evaluate the overall success of his or her own life, and we make plain by a variety of distinctions that we mean what we mean by overall success as distinct from relative success, enjoyment, how much they wish their lives to continue, and so forth. And we provide them with a set of labels, from total failure to very great success with several stops in between, from which to choose. We have no guarantee that each will use any of these labels to make the same judgment that the other makes in using the same label. Jack may use one or more of the labels with a different meaning from the meaning Jill uses, and they may be using different scales in judging the intervals between these labels. Jack might suppose, for example, that there is a vast difference between great success and very great success, while Jill understands these terms to enforce only a marginal difference, so that both might use the latter label to report judgments that we, on the basis of further conversation with them, would come to believe were in fact very different judgments. This difficulty, so described, is a difficulty in translation, and I shall suppose that we could in principle conquer it, at least for speakers of our own language, by the further conversations just mentioned. Franchement, c'est intéressant ce qu'il dit. But of course, all this assumes that there is indeed a single kind of overall judgment that we are asking Jack and Jill each to make, or that we propose to make from their standpoint on their behalf, and that this judgment is in fact a judgment about the inherent value of their life and therefore different from a judgment of relative success or a judgment about how much a person wants his life to continue or how much enjoyment he finds in it. Many people are, of course, skeptical about such judgments so interpreted. If they are right, then the judgments we ask Jack and Jill to make are meaningless judgments. But then equality of overall success is itself meaningless for that reason. Though someone might still propose, for reasons we need not explore, that people should nevertheless be equal in the character of each's illusion. If we assume that the skeptics are wrong, however, or even that equality of illusion is the true aim, then equality of overall success must suddenly seem a peculiar goal indeed, at least in the following circumstances. C'est gentil. Je fais une pause, je vais me laver. Après, je mange et après, si j'ai le temps, je continue. Où est le trou du bouchon? Voilà. Adieu.